Hello and welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Janelle Blue, president of the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, and we're also a sponsor of this program. My co-host today is Arlene Sachs. Welcome, Arlene.
Thank you.
And our special guest is Anne Bolon, and she is the owner of AnneBHistory. And today we're going to talk about writing your family story and the genealogical value of that, as well as the process. So first of all, Anne, how did you get started in this business?
Well, I started out life in the museum field, but so I worked in the museum field for 25 years. The last 10 years of that was actually working at a local K through 12 school as their school historian. And I was so impressed by how interested the kids at the school were. And because people say kids aren't interested in history. And I think a lot of times kids are presented that phrase, I know you don't think history's interesting, but they do. The kindergartners, the high schoolers, the middle schoolers, they connect the most with personal experience. If you say, we're going to talk about World War II, and something that they did in World War II was doing a scrap drive, they don't connect. If you say, we did recycling, they absolutely understand, and they connect with someone. And I thought, I was so impressed by how connected the kids would be with a personal story to help them learn about history. And I thought, then how do we capture history that's going on now? How do we capture the story and experience of living members that experience different generations, different decades of the 20th century, so that we leave that story behind? Because personal experience is how you connect with history. You might learn about it, but you connect with it and remember it if it's an emotional experience.
I think there's a difference too there. For instance, when I learned history, and I never liked history, it was a memorization of this happened in this state, and this happened in this state, and this happened in this state, and who really cared? And it wasn't until I got into genealogy that I really became interested in what was going on in Europe and all of those things. Because suddenly I realized, gee, that's what was affecting my family, and then I became more interested in the rest of the world too. But as you said, it's history can't be only memorizing facts, because that doesn't really tell you anything.
It's true. And if you want to remember history, you really want to make it personal. And especially if it connects your family, and especially things like your own story for your kids, or even your parents' story, that affected greatly who you became. My mom was very influenced by the ERA movement in the 70s. That incredibly changed my upbringing, which changed my child's upbringing. Yeah. And I think getting down those stories, the why behind the facts, because I think genealogy is about collecting and confirming the facts, which is a very important thing to do. But we're also wondering, I know that you traveled all the way back to Poland to stand in a village where your family lived.
Right.
Because what you're trying to understand is, what did their life feel like? How do I connect with my ancestors?
And young people today, everybody says this, that my kids aren't really interested in this, and I don't even know what I'm going to do with all this stuff once they get it. But what you're talking about would really bring that to life to a young person. And like when I talk about going back to Poland and standing in the place where my ancestor came from, which is now a forest.
Yes.
That's got to conjure up some thoughts and some interest that wouldn't be if I was just going to say, okay, let's go over the genealogy of your ancestors. So
it's true. It's a very different process. And if you, I like to look and see and wonder how people work. And the key seems to be genealogy is often quite popular amongst people that have, perhaps they're retired, maybe they have time. It's a wonderful detective process to work on. But if you're in the midst, perhaps you have aging parents, perhaps you have young kids, you may not have time to do the genealogy, and it feels like extra work. But you're also, when you're at that in between, that sandwich generation, you realize your parents have wonderful stories, and you want your kids to know those stories. Even if you've heard them 100 times, you want those saved. So that's how I started my business, thinking, how do we save the stories that are happening now, because it's really a companion to genealogy
It is.
rather than a substitute
Let's
for it.
talk then. But what do you do? What do you do? So
Yes.
somebody I know you had.
I've actually
Business
commissioned
dealing,
her.
yeah, okay,
Yeah.
commissioned. I was going to say business with her or whatever. So how did you get? I mean, okay, somebody contacts you, and what's the process you go through then, or what do you do?
Well, I think the biggest challenge that I have found is getting people to realize that their own story is really important to preserve. So what generally happens is their children reach out to me and say, I would love to record my parents' story or my mother's story, and it's often given as a gift, maybe a birthday gift. It's been a popular Christmas gift, Mother's Day and Father's Day. Maybe it's your dad's 80th birthday. Maybe it's your parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And again, you don't always, if your 50th wedding anniversary, you don't need more stuff. But people do want to save those memories. So someone reaches out to me, and it's often having to convince their own parents, yes, I want to do that. And there's something about receiving that gift certificate that all of a sudden they think, oh, they really do mean that. I've also found it's not very effective to send your parents a barrage of emails and say, please fill this out. I would like you to write this story out. There's something a little daunting about having to write it. But when I sit down with someone, it's a personal experience. So I get together with them, we have a consultation, and we choose the topic, because I'm not trying to get someone to record an exhaustive life story. So we choose a topic. Perhaps that's the town you grew up in. Perhaps that's a military experience. Perhaps that's a professional experience. Perhaps it's the family stories as a genealogist that you've uncovered that you want saved. We pick a topic. I then draft the questions, and then I make a big emphasis that this is just a 45-minute conversation. I do an audio recording because generally people feel more comfortable with an audio recording. I do have the option to do video. However, I've noticed that no one has chosen to be videoed yet.
I remember one time we tried to video my mother-in-law, so we turned the tape recorder on, and suddenly she was talking like this and very careful. And we said, I'm turning this off, and we didn't really turn it off, but she thought it was off, and then she could talk. So you've got to be careful about how you present it to them, because they'll be very different if they think they're being recorded.
It's very true. And I've interviewed, one of the things I started when I worked at that school was interviewing the faculty that were retiring. Here were people that had worked at the school for 30 or 40, decades. The changes
30 or 40 years.
Yes.
Not 30 or 40 decades.
Yeah, 30 or 40 years, yes. They had worked there for decades. And, I thought, have kids changed? How has society changed? How has education changed? And they had a wonderful way to view it. But people that were used to being in a classroom lecturing were then nervous. But I think one of the big things that I like to emphasize with people is that when you're recording someone's story, it's very important that, one, they know they're being recorded, because otherwise you could actually be breaking the law. This is called having the one-party consent law, and you you need to make sure there are different laws depending on the state on who has consented to be recording. So I make a big emphasis when I talk to someone so they understand how I would use this. My end product is something like this. It's a transcription of someone's story. Or you can put together multiple stories, interviews put together in here. This is their own story, but as the storyteller, they own the copyright to this story. So I'm very clear with them. I never talk about a story that I have not been given permission to share. So that's a really important thing to do, is get a release form or speak with someone verbally. You have to get consent that they know that this is happening. And you have to give them, this is not a legal deposition. If they have things they don't want to talk about, they definitely are allowed to have that option.
Do you have to get a written permission before you put it on the web? I would. If I would. You absolutely need to have at least verbal consent as part of the recording. I think people are definitely, I have not had an experience where someone did not want to share a story. They may have said, I'd like you to take that part
out later. And so I simply say that in the title page. They removed sections of the interview at their discretion. That is absolutely their right. But I always advocate for getting a written consent. Forms are very easy to find. You can look up any template on the oral history interview release form.
Do you put it on the web, or do they put it on the web?
This is absolutely their story. So what I do is I provide the family a booklet of the transcription. They get the audio file of the interview, and they get a digital copy of the transcription, so they can choose what they would like to do with it. I never publish someone else's story, nor do I write about it in a narrative way.
Okay, so they can't sue you if they
That's
put
right.
it on the. I mean, that's what I keep thinking.
Right.
That can they say something? But obviously, if you're not putting it on the web, then
Right.
if it's a printed copy and you're printing 10 copies that they get, that's between them then.
There is, there's a wonderful section on the profile page. If you're doing ancestry.com, there's a section that's called Life Story. If you wanted to add your own oral history interview, the transcript of it in that life story, you could absolutely do that. If you're doing that for a living relative, you must have their permission to do it. I took a wonderful class in graduate school called Museum Legal and Ethical Issues. And our professor, who was a lawyer for the Smithsonian, always told us, the law is the lowest common bar for behavior. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is show someone that you respect them. Mm-hmm. You want trust in that and things like that. So you must think about their feelings is probably the easiest way.
Well, that's true in genealogy too. If I'm writing a report for someone, that report cannot be used unless they give permission to use it. And those living persons who are mentioned, that is also tricky too. So it needs to be honored.
And it can be very hard to get consent after someone has passed away. So get it right when you're talking to them.
Well, let's talk a little bit also about how different your oral history interviews are from the way a genealogist would do it. I know one of the things that you said is don't bring pictures. And as a genealogist of many, many years, I know I was always heard two stories. Right. One, have a set of questions that you're asking. And this, I think, is very good for some things. And the other one is never have questions, let them talk, which is more like yours. But in either case, they've always said, bring something that to jog their memory.
Right.
Maybe you have a picture where you don't know everybody on it, but they're on it as a child. Bring that to help them jog their memory, or something that will help them remember something that of history or names that you might want. And another thing is the questions, particularly if you want to know aunts and uncles or their aunts and uncles.
Right.
If you ask them ahead of time, so often your brain works and they can't answer you right away, but your brain works while you're sleeping, and then suddenly they'll know it the next day, or wake up in the middle of the night and know it. So that's sort of a different approach to it, although I think we're both doing the same thing in the long run. We want to find out about the family, but I think genealogists are also interested in the dates and things like that, or names.
I think one of the most effective ways to interview is to have multiple people in the interview. And I know Anne, my husband's nephews came to town, and so we asked Anne to come over and do a segment where they talked about their relationship with their uncle. And that brings in a totally different dimension. I had another experience where my mother and her sisters talked together, and they sort of reacted when one would tell a story, then the other would say, well, that wasn't right, or, oh, yes, you always did that to me, or something. And so, those really add a second dimension, I think, that are valuable.
Well, I would say it depends on your people skills. If you want to try and attempt this yourself instead of hiring a professional to do it, then it is kind of a combination. I would say, in terms of the questions, I like to have a consultation with someone ahead of time and say, we are going to be talking about this subject matter. And then I love to say what I always say, put the pot on to simmer. Give them a little bit of time.
So you are giving
Yes.
them some heads on to,
And
okay.
I don't always provide them with all of the questions, but I tell them, I am not here to surprise you or upset you. So you tell me ahead of time if there are topics you do not want me to touch upon, but let's talk about, say, your military experience. Let's talk about what it was like to be married for 50 years. Think about that for a little bit. I do forward questions if I think they take a little bit of time to think about. I love to ask people, what advice would they go back and give themselves at 18? And I had a woman who said, oh, well, wear sunscreen. And then,
well, that's a good
it is a good one.
But we didn't have much. An 8
Yeah.
was tops years ago.
But after she'd thought about it, she had very different advice to pass on to her children and grandchildren after she'd had a chance to talk about it. The reason I say so I encourage someone, look through those photos ahead of time. But when you're having a conversation with someone and you stop to identify facts, you lose the thread of the story. I would say if you want to do a conversation about identifying photos, do a video where you have the photograph that you can see at the time. And then I would also challenge you to go back and listen to that interview. And it's a wonderful, in case you have sleeping problems at night, you could definitely sit back and listen to an interview about someone describing what's in a photograph.
So what sort of questions, how do you approach a question?
Right. I find a way, and again, this takes I'm genuinely interested in people's stories, the things that you learn about. You know, if I can talk to someone that lived through the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, those things shaped who I am. I'm deeply interested in that. If it's something about the Great Depression or World War II, that affected my parents. What affected them affected me, affects my daughter. It's a thing that trickles down in a wonderful way. So you have to ask a question, if you can, that can't be answered in a yes or no answer. So instead of me saying, Janelle, where were you born? So where were you born, Janelle?
I was born in Houston.
Exactly. That's a very short thing. And you're probably being interviewed by someone that knows you were born in Houston.
Right.
If I say instead, what's the most memorable thing about your town growing up? You might tell me about a 4th of July parade, or how hot it was in the summer, or the fact that your parents had a tough time doing whatever their profession was. You know, if someone was a farmer, if someone had a job that doesn't exist anymore, like a telephone operator, those can really be descriptive. It gives future generations and your own family a very colorful picture rather than a list of facts.
Do you fact check these stories?
I do not, and families are kind of surprised about that. What I do is, if someone is telling me something, they have a reason for telling that to me. This is also part of why it's not up to me to publish the story or to fictionalize and write about someone else's story. This is a process. This booklet, these books go to the family to use as they wish. I have worked with someone, he had me interview his mom as her Mother's Day present. And she was very concerned that, she didn't, she lived in this small town outside of Roanoke. She had wonderful stories. He has recorded that, and he and his sisters have taken that booklet and continued to add to it.
Oh, nice.
So they are doing the additional, adding extra pictures, things that what was your brother's personality like? Well, one of her brothers was a real jokester. Let's get down what his personality was like. That's for a later part of what the family can do for themselves. So I don't fact check. And that's why you don't need photographs. It's not research. You're simply telling me your own experience. You don't have to do research to remember what your experiences were.
And from a genealogical standpoint, those family histories can give you a lot of questions, a lot of cues to then go do more research. They can help you be able to have a starting point. But not everything in those family histories can be relied upon. And so innocently or not,
Right.
it's very important then to validate those through some sort of fact
Yes, I
checking
think
from a genealogical standpoint.
That's extremely important. We just did a show recently on original documents and the errors in original documents. I gave an example of a newspaper article from 1867 that is quoted, or 1868, before I make a mistake, and quoted in encyclopedias, because everybody took it, because our article starts, "This is a true story as told by the hero himself." Everybody assumed it was right. Well, a researcher wrote a book about it with over 500 footnotes to prove
Yes.
his point. I mean, so you wouldn't take it as something else that is just a story. But there's so much that's going on, especially with the internet, of things that aren't right. And if you start taking a family story as being absolutely right, you've got to check those. As a genealogist, you need to check out those points. And even if somebody says, well, I saw this and this, look up in a newspaper and see when the Wright brothers flew their airplane, or whatever it was. Whatever it was that somebody told you, you can check out the facts.
Because you are recording a first-person account.
Yeah.
And as any police reporter will tell you, the same people standing in the same moment can have a different impression.
Right.
But your impressions and your opinions, that's how you fight. So there was a word that was coined in 1923, you can look it up in the dictionary, called presentism. And that is putting our modern thoughts and opinions on past experiences. And I think, you want to get the facts down. If you're talking about your experience in World War II and then you found out that person never served in World War II, you do need to check that out a little bit, because we are all affected by our experiences. Mm-hmm. However, it's still a compelling story. That is something that happened to that person, and you're often asking them about their impressions. I've had women, I spoke to a wonderful woman born the first year of women's suffrage, and she told me she had felt she had never in her life been discriminated against as a woman.
Whoa.
However, then she related to me the story that her father chose her college, her father chose her college major. He, in fact, insisted she major in business, although he had no intention of having her take over his business. She was recruited to be in one of the first waves, the women volunteers in World War II. She had gone to secretarial school. She would have worked on the Manhattan Project, but she turned down being recruited because she would have outranked her husband. That was not against the regulations in any way, but culturally, that was her generation, and it's really important to honor people's cultural experience.
But I think many women in those days didn't realize that they weren't getting fair treatment.
Exactly.
That's just the way it was. Well, who's going to stay at home with the children? Or, it was such a mindset that is different from our mindset today. And the young people don't understand it, or they cannot realize that at all. And I can realize things that happened to me, which I didn't question in those days, which now it wouldn't happen, let's put it that way.
I have a middle school daughter, and I'm so glad that I do, because her understanding and perception of life is completely different from my own, which helps me realize that my perception of someone else's life might be completely different than their experience. So, she doesn't understand why sometimes women had some jobs and men had other jobs. One of my favorite stories, I took her to the DC Engineering Festival, and she wants to be an engineer. No one's ever told her that might be hard for her. We went to the booth for the Society of Women Engineers, and she said, "Mom, why would they even have that?" I recounted that story at a library presentation about why it's important to tell your story. And a woman came up to me and she said, "I'm one of the engineers that helped found that society." And it gave me a chance to tell her, "Thank you."
Yeah, thank you, and you'll be obsolete pretty soon. Hopefully.
And that's okay.
It is okay. It's okay for things to change.
Yes.
But we don't want to forget the experiences that happened before.
So, Anne, once you get the story put together and bound in some form, what do you do? What do people do with it? What would be a good thing for people to do with it?
Well, I say share it with as many people as the storyteller is willing to share with it. I mean, I'm a big believer in having a written transcript. Of course, keep the digital copy of the interview. It does help if it's digital because that can kind of frequently upgrade itself. But the number of people that have cassettes in their attic that have not transcribed the story, the paper is going to last longer. Leave this story for something behind. You can, again, you can post it online. The person themselves should post it online. So work with your narrator, work with your storyteller about how they want it shared. Share it with your family. Share it at a family reunion. Reach out to your college or your church or your organization. A lot of heritage societies have collections of oral history interviews.
Yes.
And they would love to have the transcript as well as the interview. But do know that your story can help educate more outside of even just your own family.
Yes.
Educate the next generation of what life was like.
Absolutely.
And that's something, I can give lots of examples of things that have happened that, you read something, you have no idea what it means because you do not understand life then. Why couldn't somebody come? I can't come. Right now the wash needs to be done. Well, it's because somebody had to come to do the wash, and you had you couldn't just pick up the phone and say, come later.
I want to leave behind a very varied story. History is just as complicated as present day.
Well,
so I want to leave behind that.
We want to thank you so much for talking with us today and sharing your expertise. And very briefly, can you tell the listeners how they might be able to contact you if they're interested?
Absolutely. My website is Anne with an E, B History. You can also find the website under bestfamilystories.com. My email address is annebhistory@gmail.com. But I say look at my website. You can find me on Facebook. I'm actually a member of the Mount Vernon Genealogy Society as well as Fairfax County, as well as the Jewish Genealogy Society. So there are lots of ways to find that out.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Arlene.
Thank you for having me on the show.